Welcome to the Planner Pals podcast, a podcast hosted by your two true Planner Pals. I am Jess or Jashi Curran.
And my name is Mark, and I go by Mark Your Pages. Welcome back to the Planner Pals podcast. Today's episode is going to be a good one because this is something that I think all of us either do or have talked about. And today we're going to be talking about planning for work versus planning for home, specifically the importance of planning for both of those things, the general differences between the two, and how planning for one versus the other is important, but how is it also different? And Jess, I'm curious for you as we get into this, what do you find to be the most important thing about planning between work and home? And I guess more importantly, do you do those separately?
I think that the biggest thing for me is that idea of like striving for a work-life balance type thing. I mean, I feel like it's like the mythical lands, like Narnia or something. Like, can we actually achieve balance? But if we kind of only put all of our eggs in one basket and just plan for home or just plan for work, vice versa, then you can kind of end up living a bit of an unbalanced life as a kind of result of that. So, by kind of helping ourselves out, I suppose, by having spaces in our journals related to both of those, it means that we are going to tend more in the direction of being balanced rather than just like being a complete homebody or only focusing on work all the time. In terms of actually planning for both of those, I do not think that my planning is particularly balanced between them. Would you say yours is quite balanced or not so much?
No, mine is completely 100% unbalanced. I mean, the entire reason I got started in my bullet journal was based around work because that's where I'm using it the most. And I've been sprinkling in some personal stuff throughout the years, but I do not really bullet journal for home necessarily. I think everything for me is definitely work. And then I would say more hobby related, specifically like bullet journaling, social media, the podcast, things along that, but more about like obtaining the skills, the tasks, the notes of what's going on. I really don't feel like I have anything too much really happening at home where I feel like I need to do that very much. I'm also realizing now that I'm not very much of like I'll call it like a long form journaler, really a journaler necessarily, as bullet journaling has always been kind of my main focus always. So everything that I've really done has been work focused, but I will include some home things in my work bullet journal, but it's mostly to remember events or appointments or birthdays or things like that.
Yeah, I think that mine would probably be kind of similar. And in thinking about it, like in preparing for this episode, I kind of got to thinking like, oh gosh, have I like been neglecting all of the home planning that other people are doing? Kind of think about it very much in terms of my home related task versus Vogel's home related tasks. And I'm like, oh, if I feel like if I had a look at his journal, it's probably just like stacks upon stacks of different things he's doing around the house. And I'm just like, well, I scrubbed the toilet 3 months ago, so like, don't come at me with all of your like, could you please help out?
Yeah, a lot of the chores and things like that for our house too are not really things that I feel like I have to remind myself to do. I feel like we already have kind of a cadence in the house anyway. You know, like I don't have to remind myself to do the dishes because we're a family of four and that thing's getting probably run every single night. Like most of the other things in my life, at least from a home purpose, I remember. So the only things that would maybe put in there in like a future log would be for like a bulk trash pickup. Like that's not something that I remember. I know that trash goes out on Monday, recycling is every other Tuesday. Like that I remember for the most part, but something like a big thing like bulk trash is not like, oh, I know exactly when that is. Like that'll go in my future log to remind me of, but I'm not creating like a task list or really anything else about that. It's more like, oh, that's happening. We should see what we have to put out.
I guess that's also an interesting point of like, when I think about home versus work planning, my home planning default is just chores. Just those things that you're doing on like a weekly, monthly, whatever, daily maybe basis. Daily chores, ridiculous. But there's also a lot of other things, I suppose, that would probably go into home planning or planning for home. When I kind of think about it, when I kind of expand on it outside of just the realm of chores, it kind of ends up being more like work planning versus personal planning. So, what am I kind of doing in my personal life with personal projects versus things that I'm doing business, work, earning money and stuff so I can survive?
I think it's also very much around like the executive function. If I'm using that term correctly, I think everyone kind of struggles or is okay with that executive function to remember to do those certain things or kind of how those things are supposed to happen. I don't want to use that too generally there or be too specific, but I know a number of people who have a personal journal for home. They're reminding themselves or checking things off around their morning routine, making sure that they're brushing their teeth, making sure that they're, doing whatever certain remedies or cares or things like that. I don't know if that's necessarily something that they have to remind themselves to do it versus just the action of tracking. But I know for some people that's incredibly helpful. They need that reminder, that step by step. And I think for myself, I don't have anything that routine or following a certain method or documenting it in a certain way that I feel like I need to do that to remind myself to do that. But I think for others, that might be a really big difference in how a bullet journal or journaling as a whole and tracking could be helpful for them at home. It's just not something that I personally do or feel like I personally need to do.
Yeah, no, the teeth brushing one is one that I continuously bring back into my trackers because for the longest time, my cue or the thing that would kind of prompt me to brush my teeth was you're leaving the house, you don't want to go out and smell like stank breath. Like, ew, you want that. But I don't leave the house anymore. So now that cue that I've relied on and that I built up over years of, leaving the house, going to school, then going to school as a teacher, all of that, I don't have that anymore. So
Mm.
sometimes bringing that into my journal as something that I'm tracking to literally remind me to say, hey, girl, ew, go brush your teeth. Like sometimes I need that.
Well, and I think that's an important piece. Like, if you need that to help you kind of function, that's a great example of something that you can do for home. I think for me, it's just always been where I needed the most help has been around work and tracking and remembering the things that are going on there. I feel like most other things also are happening within the family. So I have my wife as an individual person who doesn't need a bullet journal, doesn't need a reminder. It lives all up here. She's got excellent executive function where I don't. She is thinking about what's happening next. She knows the dates, kind of all those typical things, right? Stereotypical things of a fantastic wife and a dumb husband. But it's just something that's like not top of mind. But if I write it down and I look at it, I know that I'm good. But that's for everything, honestly. That's not just for like personal home things. That's even for work. There's things that happen. I have to see it on my calendar. And I'm noticing now too how I need to be even more mindful about that because like part of my job is like setting up the agendas for our team meetings or meeting with other executives and things like that. And sometimes I'll find myself like completely forgetting that it's coming up and someone on my team will remind me. I'm like, that's my job though. Like I should know that that's happening. And so I'm thinking about things for myself, even in my work journal, though, similar to what we just talked about for like the daily at home as like a checklist almost to like remind myself to look ahead a week or two in my calendar or my schedule for those things, because those are the areas where I feel like I need the most help or I'm not remembering to do those things where, brushing my teeth or, washing my hair in the morning or whatever that might be, totally different. I can also wear a hat. So, I also don't need to do everything all the time.
I'm pretty sure I could fit all of this under a hat. It might just be very uncomfortable. But I think that's interesting also, like the style of things that we're setting up for home versus work probably do have some differences. If we think about like, tracking in terms of personal daily rituals and stuff like that, are we tracking those kind of things for work? Are there daily rituals at work that need to be tracked rather than ones that are kind of written down in like a task list? And I suppose that really depends on what kind of line of work people are in, of course. I don't think there's anything that I would need to track on a daily basis specifically that would be for work. Do you have any work routines or habits that you track or?
I mean, ones that I feel like I need to or that are reoccurring every single week. So, like every Monday morning, for instance, I have to remind myself of a handful of things. So, here's a great example. I have to approve last week's timesheets for any of our contractors. That needs to happen every Monday. It should happen every Monday morning, but sometimes I will forget and I'll get a message at like 5:30, like, hey, can you approve my timesheet? So like that needs to happen. I have a Monday morning meeting that I set up. I have a Monday schedule that I do for the team, like the out of office, what's our week look like? And then also, like I mentioned, I'm supposed to be looking ahead at meetings and sending out early agendas, but I always kind of go through there. So I've actually thought recently of just maybe just printing out something that I can just stick in my weekly just to remind me, because I have to do it every single week, but I don't want to have to write it down every single week. Like that just seems like very repetitive, but I know that I need to do it and it would be super helpful. So those would be my like scheduled things that I know that I have to do that sometimes just slip my mind, because once I sit down at my computer, so many things start to come at you, emails and, people messaging you already first thing in the morning. I'm like, no, Mark, you need to focus to do these things. Like, this is what it's for. But I also feel like, I don't know if every calendar email service does this, but we're using like the Microsoft Sphere at work. And I just noticed something that Microsoft is doing now. It's called like VIA or something like that. It's like all based around mental health and reminders and like tracking your time. And I actually find it to be very helpful. I know that we're going to be talking more about tools specifically that are helping you to achieve these things, digital versus analog for home or for work. But I'm just bringing it up now because it's actually very on point. Because the other day it was like, I set this thing up so every day it'll do a virtual commute, is what it's calling it. So for the remote team members out there, I thought this was actually really awesome. And I'm going to jot it down as an idea, maybe to talk about in a future YouTube video too. But you set a time for a virtual commute, because usually when you are driving to the office, you have that 20, 30-minute, hour, depending where you live, commute. You're not working, you're not checking emails, you have that time. And Microsoft now is allowing you to schedule that for yourself as like a virtual commute, to like shut it down, have that time, and then kind of depart from work, which I really liked. It's also doing mood tracking now. It asked me at the end of the day how I felt about my day. And then it also is doing a review of tasks, but it's using Microsoft List, which I don't use. I use my bullet journal. And the other day I really was like, oh gosh, like maybe I should be using this, because it's automatically prompting me to do these things. Or I need to set those alarms almost for myself on my calendar to remind me. Like maybe that should be a Monday morning reminder for myself about those tasks that I need to do, versus setting it inside of my bullet journal. I don't know. But I think that there are definitely pros and cons to it, but also a major divide for myself between digital and analog for those things, where I think a lot of people may have that same type of internal fighting of what's personal and what's work, and should they be the same in the same spot, or potentially different too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point also, is that like sometimes we do use different tools for those different areas of our life. Like, your work tasks and all of those might be housed in a completely different notebook or a completely different system. You might be doing it digitally. It might be enforced by your employer. That could also be a thing. I know some people have a work phone, and then obviously you're going to have certain apps and stuff on that are different to your personal phone, because it's just related to a different area of your life. And then I guess it's how do we not necessarily combine them, because it's not necessarily what we're trying to do, but it's like how do we manage both of those in our overall kind of organizational system to get ourselves, cool, calm, collective, and keep ourselves productive and on the train, like in both areas. It can be kind of hard when they don't necessarily work well together, I suppose. Because my work, when I used to be a teacher, we also used the Microsoft products, which are kind of just my preference. So I've continued to use them now as I work for myself. But I find that keeping things separate has not worked well for me previously, mainly because if I tried to, I found that all of the home and personal stuff was like literally just chores related, and it was the most demotivating thing I have ever had in my planning system. So I was like, okay, I need to have them together so that there's a little bit of variance in what kind of content is going into the home space, because I was blending it with work, which also just leads me to not balance my work and home life very well, but that's a whole other kettle of fish, I suppose. In terms of like the, I guess, products, quote, quote, that you use for home planning versus work planning, I know you literally just said that you work plan more than you home plan, but what kind of differences would there be if you were using systems for both of those?
So I would say that my home organization is much more digital. So we have, I'm using email. I'm flagging things that I have to remind myself to do. I might have small things I have to remind myself of, like I said, appointments and things like that, that I will throw into my bullet journal. I did set up, I call it like my desk bullet journal. It's separate than my work journal, but I find that this is actually more revolving around social media and mark your pages than it is necessarily home tasks and things like that. I mean, everything else at home, we have a shared digital calendar that we're using just on our iPhone, and inviting each other to remind each other of those types of things. But everything else really is just us talking out loud. Really, it's my wife talking out loud, reminding me of things we have to do, or just kind of spur of the moment. I think a lot of the times it's just like, oh, we said we wanted to do this yard work this weekend during the week. And so it gets there and we just know that that's what has to be done. I don't have to write that down to remind myself necessarily. Or there's like a project that I started and didn't finish. Well, I can see that it's unfinished and I have to walk past it all the time. So that's my visual reminder that that thing has to be done. Whereas for work, is very much analog for me personally, but my entire team is digital. We're a fully remote team. So all the tools that we're using, how we communicate, everything is digital. But for myself, my own personal organization, it's my bullet journal first. And then anything I'm writing down or doing, then I eventually have to translate into a digital space. I was just, my friends at work were laughing at me the other day because I was showing them something in Miro, right? So just a collaborative workboard. But I took a picture of my bullet journal and then put the pictures on there because I had written out these notes and kind of drawn out this process of what I was thinking. And it was just easier for me to write it down and just take a picture of it and put it in there than it was for me to like start there or recreate it digitally. I'd already done the work. They just had to give their feedback on it. But there are times like that, though, where I feel like, Mark, you have to remember to translate this into where everyone else is working because not everyone can read your journal. You're not in the office anymore.
I guess that's also a point, eh? Like, because you work with other people and you have a team and they're in a digital space as well, you kind of have to accommodate them in a way.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think about you often when we talk about this because you are in such a very like specialized kind of place because until you hire more people for the true team, Jashi, I think that you're kind of on your own. So everything you're doing is really for yourself inside of there. But like what about you mentioned before that your work home is separate but like kind of involved. Like what tools are you all using, I guess, for yourself and your significant other versus just yourself for social media?
Mine's less about like, home is more digital and work is more analog or anything like that. Both of them are very much kind of blended systems, more so leaning on the analog than it is on the digital. So the digital kind of like augments or like supplements, I suppose, the overall planning system I have. So in terms of work, the only thing that I really do digitally for work is Notion. I use Notion to plan out when video content's coming out, mainly because I can drag and drop things. So when I decide that I can't get a particular video done, I can put it on another week. I could bring another video idea in, and that's also a really good place to just plan out the videos as well. I don't like writing long handwritten notes. So if I want to write out like a script or any kind of like talking points or anything like that, it's just way easier to do that digitally than in a notebook. It'll also end up being a lot more legible and a lot more user friendly for me later. Doing future me a favor there. In terms of digital for home though, it's really just a shared calendar that does not get as utilized as it could because Vogel still ends up asking me like, "Oh, when's Carrie's birthday party happening?" I'm like, "I put it on the shared calendar. If you checked, you would know this. Fine." Went all this effort to set it up and he doesn't even use it. Sounds like his bullet journal, but it's fine. So we've also got my journal fleet, I suppose, and then in that we have the one that's kind of primarily, I guess, for work would be all of them now as I think about it, because setting up journals is my work. So it doesn't really, having them separated becomes really tricky when the way that you're effectively making money and, your profession is making journal content. And it's also the way you organize your life. So I find that the separation is a little bit hard to achieve because they're so kind of like intertwined with one another.
It's definitely helpful in our space when the content you're creating revolves around what you're using to do that. I think very much about when I first started my bullet journal account. I mean, I couldn't have the account without the bullet journal, and I needed the bullet journal to really help me continue to succeed at work. So really the content feeds itself. I mean, I find personally the hardest stuff for me to create is the stuff that has to be kind of like thought up out of the blue. Like right now, you and I are both on the Archer and Olive Ambassador team. And so we're required each month to create content and blog posts and do all of this. And I appreciate it because it does help me kind of think outside of my normal, right? Like how would I use these things? And a lot of the times I'm just like, well, it's not that I'm an overly creative planner. So I can't really like come out with these like how to make a travel spread for the next 6 months. I don't know. I'm making random things up there.
Have you been reading my blog post? Oh my god, that's literally what I'm writing right now.
Well, see, that's the thing. Like you have all of those creative ideas and can kind of think through those things, but like my brain just for whatever reason doesn't work that way. So a lot of the times I'm like, okay, how to use acrylographs, and but how would I use them and how do I use them in my journal? or whatever that might be. Whereas like making a weekly spread in my bullet journal is something that I am doing anyway because I need to do that for work. So just record that and use that as content, right? I'm using my bullet journal throughout the weeks. I'm creating ideas for work spreads and things like that. Like it's just wonderful when you have to do that and you're just going to remind yourself, well, just record that because that's content. It also gets in the way a lot of the times too. I'm not going to lie. And I'm sure you have the same exact, situation where you're like, I just need to do this thing. You're like, but where is my camera? Lights, action. You're like, you were just running down a moat, Mark. Like it is not that big of a deal. But I think that it's super helpful though when it's like that versus an account for like sewing or some other hobby type account. It's not directly related with what we do day to day. So it's maybe a little bit difficult or a different mindset. Like for us, it's just always there, I feel like.
Yeah, it can also be kind of an interesting but tricky relationship in a way because, okay, you start your planner because you need to plan. You know, you have things you need to organize in your life, you need to write stuff down. But then you start taking pictures of it and sharing it on Instagram or making videos of it and sharing it on YouTube and stuff. And so, where does it become I am planning because I need to plan and I'm also filming it just to share because versus I'm planning because I need something to film to share it?
I also think that's why a lot of creators that have burnt out or are not around anymore, maybe for that exact reason. They had created a bullet journal for maybe a time and place in their life, and they no longer needed that, but maybe they'd gain a following. And so they're creating and pumping out content just for the sake of it and never really using it. I mean, I know of at least two creators in the past that I've like talked to, and especially earlier on where I was like, I love your stuff. It's so amazing to see all these ideas. Like, do you ever post like after the pens? They were like, don't tell anybody, but I don't use any of this in my daily life. So they were really creating bullet journal content. One of them specifically didn't even know what the bullet journal method was. They were like, I saw that there is this thing, bullet journaling. So I started to do it, but I don't like use it or anything. And that just like floored me. And I was like, oh my gosh, well, wait a second. Like, how are you putting out content around bullet journaling, but you don't use the bullet journal method? And I think that's earlier on in my mind, right? The two are the same. Your bullet journal, you use the bullet journal method, but it wasn't until years later and even a lot recently, you and I talked about that like creative planning isn't necessarily always bullet journaling, but sometimes bullet journaling is creative planning, right? Like there's a bullet journal method and then there's creative planning. And some people just do the creative planning as a way to do whatever. And bullet journal is the Kleenex of tissue, right? It's just what you call the thing. Whereas some people are actually using, like myself, the bullet journal method, but I am doing some creative planning inside of there. And so I don't know, it was a very hard thing for me to be like, well, how do you do this without using it? I just don't know. It hurts my brain to think about it.
I like your point of it being the kind of like Kleenex of the journaling world, I suppose. We've just taken that term and started to apply it to things that don't necessarily relate to the original method. But I also like the idea of, creative journaling versus maybe bullet journaling or what I'm going to call like functional journaling or functional planning. And possibly that could be something that there's like a difference point for people in terms of how they plan for home versus how they plan for work. Like maybe one of those is more of a creative space for them, and the other one is more of just like a purely functional, stripped back kind of thing. I know for me, I found that even when I was working as a teacher, it still had to be kind of creative. Otherwise, I didn't like to look at it. I wouldn't use it, and then there was no point to it. But for your style, you do tend towards the more like stripped back functional-esque kind of layout, say.
I do. And then every now and again I throw something in, like this week was distressed oxide. I popped that out of my stationery box and I was like, let's use this week. But it's actually, honestly, if anyone wants to be like, Mark, how does your brain work? I always talk about this idea of having the foundation down first and then kind of adding to it. So like this past week, for instance, in my bullet journal, it's exactly it. I had laid it out for what I needed, which was like a very small daily overview for each day of the week, and then room for notes and room for tasks and capacity planning that I do for my team, right? And once that was in set, then I laid kind of that creative, the distress oxide over top of that, because it's the icing to the cake for me. I don't need the icing, but icing is delicious. But it was that I had everything kind of set there and ready to go. And so that's exactly it. I think sometimes where I get myself caught up, where I'm like, no, I'm more functional planning, but then I do add stickers and stamps and distressed oxide and all this fun stuff to it. But it's always in addition to a solid foundation that I have first. Because when I've done it the other way around, you get through and you're like, I have a bubble that's this big. I can only write 2 things in it. I need to write 10 things inside of it. It kind of threw me off a lot, where then I reset myself and said, always, Mark, foundation first, then icing on top. So just, I'm actually curious, like talking about that, right? This functionality and kind of adding things on top of it. I feel like you are the queen of themes. You are the queen of also really smart, important techniques that people can use. I'm curious of what techniques you find yourself using, whether this is for home, your bullet journal weeklies, or kind of how you approach design problem solving.
Yeah, I think that when I was in a more structured profession, one where I had to stick literally to a timetable because I was a teacher, I found that things that were very much related to kind of like schedules, time batching, that kind of stuff were really more necessary. Nowadays, when I'm working for myself and I'm a little bit more flexible with my time, it's like, oh, do I want to work at 10 p.m.? Sure, why not? There's nobody here to stop me, which is so dangerous. But I find that layouts that really rely on tables, especially things like Alastair method tables, whether that be kind of like workflows in terms of, hey, here's a series of projects you need to do. Spoilers, they're all videos. So here are all the videos you need to do, and here are all of the steps you need to take to work on them. Those kind of structures I find I'm very attached to. I'm very drawn to those ones. And I use them quite a lot at work. And now, as we've kind of gotten onto this topic, I'm thinking about like, how could I use them at home as well in a way that would be, well, one, I'd actually use it. That'd be nice. So I can, two, be a better life partner. And three, Vogel can stop bitching at me. That'd be nice. Yeah, in terms of the the work around the house, that is very much more of his kettle of fish rather than mine. And I could do better at planning for those kind of things. So I am starting to think more about like, okay, well, what kind of layouts could I set up in that space that I would find approachable because I've used them previously. I found success with them in my work kind of related life, bring those into the home space and actually make better use of those. In terms of the home related layouts that I have thus far, my main one would probably just be my home projects list, and that's just a list. Like it's literally in the title, so that one's kind of easy. But outside of that, I don't think I have anything specifically home like house related. Do you have any kind of techniques in particular that you're drawn towards often in either area?
I would say that it's definitely more leaning towards work, but I can see how this could be very useful if you have a lot of home things going on. So there's 2 techniques or methods that I specifically use relatively often. I would say the first is the Eisenhower method. So that is the kind of the 4 quadrant box: the do, decide, delegate, and delete. And plotting those things on there, I will bring out of the toolbox, especially when I feel like I have a lot going on all at once. And so I'll do that for work a lot, where I'll just like brain dump all the things that I feel like have to be done. And then I'll go ahead and like take a moment and kind of plot them inside of that matrix to help me just kind of understand and break it down and sometimes prioritize. And then the other one is probably my most favorite. I don't always use this exactly as it is created, but it's called the Ivy Lee method. And this is one that I learned a number of years ago, actually from James Clear had written about this in one of his books and journals that he did with Baron Fig in the back. And I was like, I really love this. For anyone who doesn't know what the Ivy Lee method is, it's this method created by Ivy Lee. He was hired by this big company essentially to come in and like help all of their executives be more productive. There's also this really fun story behind it where the owner of the company was like, how much do I owe you? And Ivy Lee was like, I'm going to teach everyone this method and then you decide what you're going to pay me afterwards, which is the ballsiest baller move ever in the entire world, right? But essentially what the method does is help you plan in advance for your day. And what you're supposed to do in this is every single day, the day before it. So like, let's say you are going to work on a Monday. On Sunday night, you write down the 6 most important things you have to do tomorrow, and you actually list them out 1 through 6. And that way, when you come to work on Monday, you know exactly what you have to get done, and you don't change your list, and you don't move on to the next one until you accomplish the first task that you give for yourself. And then by the end of the day, for Tuesday, before you leave on Monday night, you do the same exact thing. And I love this for a number of reasons. I think one, it kind of helps with that bullet journal methodology of the daily log, because you set up your day, your six most important things, and then you kind of are like rapid logging below that, your task and your notes and whatever else. But then you're taking a moment at the end of your day to reflect on that day and set it up for the next day. And so that's actually one I have brought into play a number of times. Sometimes I won't do six. I might do like my big three or something like that, I'll call them. But it very much plays off of like, these are the most important things you have to do today, and they have to get done today in this order because I've thought about it. And it's one that I've shared with others. And the fun part of the story at the end, essentially, is that he taught everyone how to do this. And then he came and said, okay, what do you want to pay me? And the owner was like, oh, I'm going to pay you, I forget, X amount of money, which ended up being like $1 million back in the day at this time. There's probably a lot more dates and specific things around that story that I should know. But really, the big idea here is that you are setting yourself up for success the day before. You're prioritizing yourself the day before. So you come to work or come into whatever situation the next day with a list of things you already have to do. So there's no morning paralysis because you've already thought through it, and nothing is going to change this. And I just really like that. And so often, again, whenever I feel like I'm all over the place, I kind of bring a method into place. I mean, technically, I feel like Bullet Journal is supposed to be doing this for us too. It's in the method, so you don't feel that way. But sometimes I need to bring in other things just to be like, this is different, this is new, and you're going to follow this process for the week. And then I end up just going back to just daily logging or weekly logging for my bullet journal, and I feel okay. But those are probably the two that I say I bring in most often. Again, I don't necessarily use them for home because the home tasks, like we've already talked about, are not that urgent or important as much as the work ones are for myself.
I think that's really it's very good to see that kind of technique that like you very much could use it in your home life though. It doesn't have to just be in work life, even if it's kind of typically talked about in that space. Like I don't really see myself probably setting up an Eisenhower matrix for home tasks. It's just not one that really resonates with me. But the idea of setting up like your top six and actually sequencing them, that is the kind of thing that makes my brain happy. I find that I kind of do a very soft version of this in that in the days where I'm just like everything is everywhere, I'm a scatterbrained mess, I have no idea what I need to do. In fact, actually, I do have a really good idea of it, and that's why I'm overwhelmed, or something like that. Whatever. I find that just setting aside, like, this is the daily highlight. This is the one thing that if I get to the end of the day and I've finished it, I will feel accomplished, often knowing that I will work on other things and there will be other things that I make progress on in some way. But just setting it aside as like a this is the one thing, this is the focus. And then if I finish that, okay, let's pick the next focus. I guess in the idea of making it a sequence of six, you've already got the next ones picked out for yourself. But I also really like the idea of setting it the day before or on a Friday if you're going to work on a Monday, because it's just doing future you a favor. Like, future you does not have to make the choice because current you, who has a better understanding of everything that's going on or whatever, is making that choice for you. That's really cool. I like that.
And what I think I like the most about whether it's bullet journaling or planning, or really honestly a DIY journal altogether, just a dot grid notebook, is that nothing is set for you. I know some people like to have those planners with the dates and the specific things in it that they're looking for. And I think if that works for you, that's fantastic. But what I have always loved about the way that I've planned essentially with a blank notebook is that I can pull in these tools when I need them and then kind of take them out of my life when I don't and go back to what I need. Versus I feel like if every week started with some type of a template where I did that, I just don't know in practice that I would want to use that all the time, because sometimes I feel like I've got it and I'm on top of it. I know exactly what I have to do, but it's those moments when I feel out of control where I'm very thankful that I've educated myself around these different methodologies so that I can kind of pick it off the shelf when I need it and put it right back up there for when I don't.
I feel like we're definitely going to have an episode which is just like favorite productivity and get shit done kind of tips, because like that's just a space that I could talk for a very long time about. So we're not going to do it this time. We already have a focus, but I think that would be a fun topic for a future episode.
It would be, and I could get the details of my Ivy League story like nailed down, so it probably makes a lot more sense. But I guess just let's give a little preview of what that episode might look like, especially around work versus home. Are there any like specific tips that you have, whether you've learned or that you give to others, or for all the other planner pals, that you think is like your top tip for the difference or planning for work versus home, or even combining them or separating them?
I think that one of the bigger tips that I would have for this is if you are finding that you cannot keep up with one journal, do not introduce another. Like, do not split things out to be like a home journal and a work journal if you can't even keep up with one. And that's not me trying to be mean to you, all right? I'm saying this with so much love. Instead, what I would probably recommend would be to either like section out your notebook so things are still all in the one space. You know, you don't have to add additional things into your lineup to keep track of. One of the ways you can do this is literally just by having like front half and back half. So you could have like a certain section that you kind of start from to do, you know, home or work, whichever one you want to put in whichever space. But what I have seen some people do is like they literally take their notebook and the front half is work, and then they start working from the back to do home. So you just start from the back page and go, I guess, forward from there, backward. How would we describe that? That would be one thing. Like, you know, don't add additional notebooks into your lineup or planners into your lineup if you're finding that you're struggling to just keep up with one. Another thing that can be very useful is actually having separate spaces for planning in either area in a more kind of regular structure that you use. So, for instance, if you're setting up weekly logs for yourself or weekly layouts, maybe having separate task lists for home versus work means that then you don't have all of those things interdispersed with each other. It means that when you're in the spaces to work on those things, like at work or at home, you can just focus on the tasks that are relevant to that space. That can be really helpful. Do you have any tips for people?
Yes, I do. Actually, I had to pull out this example because what you said just resonated with me so much about don't pull it out just yet if you don't need it. So like here's a visual example of my weekly bullet journal spread for a week, right? Like everything going on, all my notes and tasks. I decided that I'm going to take out kind of those other things. Here's my weekly bullet journal for just like at home. This could fit in one journal. I did not have to break this out necessarily. So that's just a really good example. But I think in my mind that I needed it. And I made this choice because I kept it all together first. So it's kind of a similar thing to yours, Jess, which is if you're unsure, keep it all together or keep it all in one notebook, because I think there are a lot of ways and layouts that you can use to do that. So I like that idea of working, you know, front to back for work and back to front for home. Now that would bother me, I feel like, because bleh. But something I have done actually when I've been playing around with this idea is also just taking your page and splitting it right down the center and keeping tasks for work and notes for work on one side and home on the other. Because what I started to do over time essentially was try to outgrow my notebook with a topic. So that's a great example where I was like, okay, I'm going to split my page in half, task and task. Now, if my home or social media or whatever task outgrew that page, I was like, okay, let's make a mental note of this, right? I can continue on a different page. And if that happened continuously over time, I would say, okay, it definitely needs its own space versus, you know, taking yourself out of this other notebook and that flow and everything else to kind of keep them together. I think for myself personally, I know mentally that work and my social media stuff are separate things. When I'm at work, that's my job. When I'm not at work, if I'm on lunch or after work or before work, that's when social media happens for me. That's where I do scheduling. That's where I make my content. I do all those things. So I think for myself, even it's helpful for me not to mix those two things because those are essentially two full-time jobs, honestly, when you break it down. I work, you know, between 8 and 5 o'clock in my full-time job. And then before work and after work, I'm doing the other full-time job, social media. It's more fun, but you know what I'm saying? So I think it's very much the same vein, is that try to make it work in one, give yourself separate spaces or ways to do that. But once you feel that you've actually outgrown that space, then maybe consider that second notebook before starting off with two, because I think it would, and I know it would because I've been there several times, it will make you more nervous and anxious because you're like, oh, I have this idea for this thing. Where is that notebook? Crap. Do I write it inside of the one I'm using right now versus the other? Or trying to make that mental switch, I think, is going to make you a little bit more crazy.
Yeah, I think that the hard part about having them separated as well is like, what if I'm in one space or the other and I don't have access to the notebook that I need? So if you've got a, you know, notebook that's just for your home related life, home related tasks, chores, personal projects, whatever, but you have a thought about that while you're at work away from your notebook, now you either have to write it in your work notebook, which kind of defeated the purpose of splitting them, or you have to put it somewhere else to then transfer into your notebook when you get home, or it just gets a little bit messy. And that's why I found that I prefer to just have them together. Also, kind of like you said, when you split them out and you just don't have enough stuff to really warrant having another notebook. Or when you split them out and you realize, cool, the only things I have going on for home are chores, and that's really demotivating. So I'm just not going to look at my journal.
hmm
So,
I think another tip too, and this just came to mind, is maybe to start small and grow from there. So a really great example is if you have an A5 size notebook for yourself for work, this is the size you're using, and you're thinking you're slightly outgrowing that, maybe you try something like the B6 size, which I know a lot of people are very popular now, or like, I would have like your little tiny notebook that, again, all the tasks that I showed you in my A5 could have fit on one of these little pages here and I would have been okay. But start there and then slowly grow it. So instead of going from like an A5 to being like, I need a B5 for all my extra stuff at home, and then suddenly you're like using this much space inside of there, start smaller and kind of grow from there. I think that's another really great way that you could approach it if you do want to separate it out, to kind of try it and see if it works.
yeah, I think that idea of doing what we call like an ooch, so it's like you're doing a test run or a trial of something
Mhm.
before you commit to getting all of the, expensive or better supplies or whatever to make a full-fledged notebook or whatnot. It can just give yourself the opportunity to test run it and say like, okay, is this actually going to work for me? Maybe do a couple of trials to see like the layout that you might need for it or anything like that before you go out and buy a whole new notebook for something that might not actually end up resonating with you at all.
Total sidetrack here. I just want to have to say that someone told me that I should start a notebook for all the Jessisms that you do. So I have two: barrel of fish and ooch are now two new words that I've learned from you that I feel like I need to add to this index of fantastic words and phrases that I've never used or heard of before in my life.
I literally have a section in my long-term collections journal that's just called shit I say.
Oh, perfect.
So, like things like good luck other drivers anytime I make a slightly interesting or risque decision. It's like, well, have fun with the choices that I made, everybody else.
I also love the it's a future B problem, because I used that one time after doing this podcast for so many weeks, and someone was like, Jess says that all the time. I'm like, yeah, Jess and I have been hanging out a lot recently, so I'm starting to pick up on those.
Persnickety Biscuit is always going to be a favorite, though. I'm glad that we can at least have that as one of our shared lingo points now.
It's one of my absolute favorites. So something that I wanted to kind of think about with those tips are ways for people to also kind of bring things together, or maybe some other ways that they could approach things in a digital way. So we've talked a lot about analog and notebooks in there. Do you have anything that you think would be helpful for anyone that's maybe in that spot with trying to combine home, whether it's just with themselves or another person? I mean, we've talked a lot about that with like a spouse or a roommate or anything else where you have shared information. Like, what's a good way that you think people could utilize different tools to make that happen better?
I think that the hardest part about a shared system is finding something that works for both or however many parties. Because I know, for instance, Vogel has a journal. He pretty much only uses his bullet journal for home related stuff. He doesn't write anything work related in there, but it's not my journal, so it's not like I'm going to go and write down tasks for him and or I to do in his notebook. That would feel a little bit weird. But we do have a shared calendar. When we both check in with it, it works really well. But when we don't both check in with it, it doesn't work quite as well as it could. So it's finding tools that both you and the people who you're trying to kind of collaborate with are going to be comfortable with using and actually make use of, which can take a little bit of training, I suppose, either for yourself or for the other people to kind of check in with that. So it's really, I guess, about the people that you're working with, what their preferences are, whether or not you can get them on board with certain tools. I know that some people have set up things like shared calendars and shared kind of notebooks, wall calendars in particular, because you can usually put them in a space where people can actually see them, whether that be on the front of the fridge or next to the fridge if you don't want to stick a calendar on your fridge, somewhere in a kind of like high traffic area where a lot of the people in your home are going to frequent, rather than just in your own personal space where it might be a bit weird for them to come in to check on plans. Like, I don't think I'd want a family member flipping through my bullet journal to find out when things were happening. That would feel a little bit strange.
Yeah, it reminds me actually when we talk about, life influencing work and work influencing life. It's, work, whenever you're introducing a new tool or some type of change, it's always about how can you be a good change agent. And a lot of that has to do with influencing and educating and getting people used to it. I actually just did this at work recently where I introduced a new tool and a new method of how we work to a team of 12. And I had to do that in a process of saying, okay, first let me research to find out the right tool that's going to work for the problem we're trying to solve. Two, let me try it for myself to see how well it works so that I can understand it. And then three, let me educate and slowly get people into using that. And I think that that could definitely influence home for myself, because I've tried a number of things where I'm like, oh, I love this tool. I think this is great. Let's all use it. And then like everyone else is like, I have no interest in that. Like that's too hard for me to do. I just like to do it this way. And so a lot of the times I found that the shared calendar is a great idea, but like you said, it has to work. I know that there's a number of products out there that kind of take that team calendar, or your family calendar, I guess is a better way to talk about it, and puts it on like a bigger screen. And I've seen it before. I don't know if it works that way or not, but it's essentially what you said. It's in a common place and everyone sends things to the calendar. It's kind of like a work calendar, right? Like here's what's going on and you see it all the time. That's why I think, again, I love the analog calendar when you write things down. We have that in my house. I don't use it as much as I probably should, but I go there whenever I'm like, oh, I remember someone said this thing. And instead of bothering my wife, asking her for the millionth time, what is that happening? I know that it's there. So I can go there and do that. So I think more than anything, I don't know if there's any kind of new tools that can be used. I know I've tried to introduce Airtable to social media friends when I've been planning things, and they're like, yeah, I don't use this and I can't figure this out and I don't want to figure it out, where I feel very comfortable because I actually love that tool for collecting ideas and doing things at work. I just don't think I have any real need for it for home. Just for myself personally, I use that for myself. But if you find that you are collaborating with other people, I think having a solid space to do that, especially if you're in the Apple sphere, I feel like they've made it very easy now with like shared notes. I know this sounds very silly, but like our dog walker, for instance, I did this with. I just set up a note. I put all the dates that I needed her to come to like let the dogs out and take them for a walk. And I shared that with her. And I said, hey, are you okay with using this? And she said, yeah, absolutely. And she would check it off every time we did. And I had a separate column for when I paid her, and it just worked really well that way. So I think that's a good example of just finding a tool, saying, hey, does this work for you? Can we try it? And then someone doing that is another way of doing that. And then there's also, I think it's called Freeform, right? I think, which is like Apple's like shared idea notebook. My wife and I actually used that just once. We were going to purchase another home and we were just taking notes and calls. And I said, there's so much information. I can't write it all in my notebook and you have it in yours. And so we just agreed for that project that we were going to use that. And it worked pretty well for us. We just haven't had a need to go back to it. But I think there are tools that are kind of already on the devices and things that we're using that are easy to use. So that's what I would say, that if I were to use them more, probably utilize those tools.
Yeah, I think it can be very helpful in trying to find these tools that, multiple people can use. Is like, how can we use the ones we're already using or the ones we're already familiar with rather than trying to reinvent the wheel? Obviously within reason. So for instance, one of the tools that Bogle and I use is OneNote. We have our like recipes on there. We also have a home care notebook in there, mainly because he really likes OneNote and I look at it and go like, this could be in Notion and it would be a lot better and we'd actually be able to find things and all of this kind of thing. I'm like, yeah, but then I have to teach Bogle how to use Notion. So, no. But I know that he is comfortable with that and I can tolerate it, so we use that. Even though I think that there are other tools that would be far superior, it's all good. As long as the information is somewhere and we can both access it and we can find the stuff we need to within a somewhat timely manner, it's all good.
I feel you on that. I feel like if that was me and I really despised using a tool, that I would do everything in my power to do exactly what I said. What's the problem I'm trying to solve? What tools are out there? Let me try to use it and then use that as an example to be like, look, this works better for these reasons. I know that you like this. Here's how this is like this, but better for all of us. I just think I'm always kind of the early adopter when it comes to tools and technology. So I feel like I'm always the one introducing new tools and technology to people versus the opposite, where they're like, Mark, this new thing. And I'm always like, no, let's do it this way. I'm very open minded. It was a hard thing for me to do for a long time whenever someone approaches me, because I'm so used to being the one with the new ideas. But I think allowing yourself to be open to it, and this is advice for anyone who was like, no, this is how I do it. Like, let someone approach you with an idea if you think it's going to work, especially if it's at home and it's going to make your life a lot better. But same thing for work as well. If there's just a better tool that's going to help you be more efficient and effective, like, be open minded to it. And if it's not your cup of tea to like go and look for those things, then I think, someone else is really excited. Let them be excited.
I think that's really good advice. I mean, I know that I can get very particular about which tools I'm using for different things, and being open to trying out new styles of planning, whether that be digital or analog or whatever, it just helps us to kind of improve our system over time, whether that be for kind of work or home life. I suppose, like, question for you, Planner Pal, what does your planning system look like in terms of home planning versus work? Is it very balanced, or do you find yourself kind of veering into one area more than the other? Do you use different tools for either your work or home planning? Let us know more about your system either in the comments, or if you wanted to email us at plannerpalspodcast@gmail.com, or hit us up on Instagram at plannerpalspodcast. We would love to hear from you.
In this episode, we talked a lot about finding the right solution for what you're doing, whether it's at home or for work. But in our next episode, we're going to be talking about the next click down and talking specifically about layouts and spreads that work for us inside of our planners, and definitely which ones we would recommend to others as well. So very much looking forward to that episode, Jess. Like I said, you are the queen of themes. You always have 50 ideas for this certain idea, but I know that inside of those 50 ideas, there's those tried and trues that we have as well. So very much looking forward to that episode.
It's going to be a good one, Mark. I'm very looking forward to that conversation. And to you, Planner Pal, thank you for watching.